Gary, good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, we're back after our week off over Easter, and we've got a guest to tell who we're going to have on the show this week.
Yeah, so Chris from Totally EV is on the go. Well, totally other things as well. He's a really good friend of mine who's been in the industry from the press side for quite a while, and knows his audio and knows his cars, and that's what we're going to be talking about.
So we're talking audio in EVs and in petrol and diesel and everything. So yeah, let's get over to Chris.
So welcome to a special episode of the Digital Lifestyle Show, and we're joined by Chris. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Chris Minasians, and I am the editor and director of Totally EV. So I focus on fully electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, and I also do consumer electronic reviews on YouTube. And I think that's how I met Gary while I was a tech journalist, and I review mainly audiovisual products.
Yeah, we spent a long time talking about headphone amplifiers and things when I first chat. It was a good chat. So we thought we'd marry the two subjects, Chris, today, because your passions for EVs and your passions for audio, and talk about car audio.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I remember we met at a few of the events, and we talked about podcasts for starters, but then also just generally audio and cars, and it's the two passions that we've got as well. So we've got something in common as always. So I don't know how long I've known you for, but we've always seemed to gravitate towards those subjects. But yeah, in-car audio is something that I thought to do and cover on Totally EV, because I don't think there's enough coverage when it comes to in-car audio systems. And it might sound silly to car buyers, but it's actually quite relevant, because in the EV space, you've got cabins which are even more insulated than ever. So you've got a very quiet cabin, and most people like to either, let's say, listen to a podcast. Of course, they'll be listening to yours, other than any other podcast out there in the world.
Of course, yeah.
Or they'll be listening to music or whatever it might be. And so audio systems come to become a lot more relevant. And so when I was doing the reviews, I thought, well, why don't I do the review of the car, but also do a separate review of the in-car audio system? And it seems to have been actually quite popular. A lot of people actually are subscribed for the in-car audio systems, let alone the actual cars themselves, because they're actually fascinating tech, about the things that they do. I'm weaving in all different things over here. So, but yeah, so in-car audio systems are quite relevant, and manufacturers seem to be emphasizing it even more now. When it comes to the spec sheets of their cars, they seem to be saying, oh, it's got XYZ manufacturer that's behind it, or even if it's an in-house system, they will say, oh, we have got X amount of speakers and X amount of wattage. So yeah,
I know it makes a difference, because when I really changed my car, and the model up had the better speaker system, and I went for that one, because the music's important, and I want it to sound good. And when you listen to your music collection, you want it or your podcast, you want it to sound good, and the surround sound or extra speakers, 6 speakers or whatever, it makes a difference. And you come a long way from having a tiny little tinny speaker under the connected to your little cassette player, because I do remember doing that on my Morris Marina back in the 80s. So yeah, we've come a long way from that.
Absolutely love that. No, it's true. But it's interesting that what you just said there, in terms of the option for you to get the better audio system, you'd have to go for the higher trim. And that's something that I actually dislike that manufacturers are doing, is because they're forcing you to get a more expensive trim, when in reality all you want is a certain option. And it goes the other way around. You've got certain manufacturers that offer you every single option you can think of, but don't offer you anything as standard, which is really ridiculous, especially for the asking price that the car comes in at. So yeah, it's interesting that their manufacturers trying to streamline their trims, and within that you've got the audio systems, and sometimes that extra upgrade is worth it for the audio system alone, let alone the other goodies that you get. Let's say, I don't know, a sunroof or whatever it might be, heated seats, or I don't know, anything it might be. So yeah.
So you mentioned the extra insulation on EVs, and this is very true. And this isn't actually to help with the sound systems. It's because they are so quiet that you hear all the noise outside normally. So obviously they've made that effort to actually insulate them even more than the previous. And I remember when I first got in my iPace, when I first had it, and shut the door, and the noise, everything just went quiet. It was just incredible. And of course, that actually even had active noise reduction. That it was doing active noise cancellation from outside to even make that even more so. And that actually made, although the sound system had its limits on that system, it was a fairly well done brand, but the bass wasn't necessarily always all that good on it, mainly because of where they placed the subwoofer. But the rest of the sound was just amazing. It was so clear, so precise. And that's what I like in my music. And we've discussed this before, but I'm very much about clarity, and the clarity was just incredible. And I've never experienced that before in a car. And I think that a lot of that is down to the amount of reverb you're getting from the engine noise, and that actually interfering with your actual ability to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's more, as we said, it's more relevant in EV more than anything before, but there's loads of different factors now. I think it's not only that the build quality of the cabin, as in the interior materials that they're using, but even it comes down to the tires, how the tires are insulated, because there's dedicated EV tires, as I'm sure you'll know, Gary, that they're actually tuned for EVs, not only in terms of efficiency, but also due to the insulating materials that's within them to make them quieter on the road. And then you've also got more streamlined designs, again, not only for efficiency and aerodynamics, but you've got reduction of wind noise because of slightly smaller or slightly accentuated wing mirrors, or even A-pillars that are angled slightly differently. So it does make a big difference. And it is quite interesting when I'm sitting inside EVs or even hybrids and comparing, contrasting, and seeing how well or how much the manufacturers actually thought about in-cabin insulation. And then, of course, then it comes with the audio clarity, as you were saying, in terms of the mid-range, where you've got the vocals coming out to the foreground. A lot of people listen to, again, if they're listening to news, podcasts, and things like that, that's going to be the most important element in the frequency range, and they really want to concentrate on the mid-range. But often manufacturers will neglect the mid-range for accentuated highs and accentuated lows, so bassy tunes and quite nice toe tapping feeling at the top end for that kind of warm sound signature, but we'll forget actually the mid-range is just as important, because you want the vocals to come out and listen to any sort of genre that you're listening to, because you want to hear the vocals. So yeah, mid-range is an interesting one.
So how would a manufacturer sort of make it work better for mid-range? Is there somewhere about speaker placement, size, that sort of thing?
Yeah, combination of it. I think placement's actually really important, and I think it's underestimated as to how important speaker placement is. Unfortunately, as consumers, unless you go aftermarket, you can't really do much about it. Other than the fact of, if you wanted to drill in holes and go for an aftermarket solution and completely get a revamped audio system. But in reality, it is down to the manufacturer to actually work with either audio manufacturers or themselves when they're building it in-house and designing the car to say, okay, where do we want to place the speakers within the car so that our consumers, be it in the passenger seat or in the rear of the cabin or even the driver, is going to get the best sort of experience, no matter what sort of music they're listening to. So yes, the placement of the audio drivers is very important, and it very much varies depending on the size of the cabin and the type of the car. So sometimes you'll see tweeters placed in the A-pillars, and sometimes you'll find tweeters that are placed within the doors or even the mirror triangles. And more often than not, you'll find a combination of tweeters placed there. Within the headrest, sometimes you'll find some speakers, and even within the dashboard. So it's just how the manufacturer lays it out. And yes, for you to get the best sort of mid-range, ideally you'd want dedicated mid-range drivers, as in, when I say drivers, I mean speakers. You'd want mid-range speakers so that people are getting the full mid-range from that certain speaker, and then they're getting the highs from the tweeter, and then they're getting the lows from the woofer, and then they're getting the sub bass from the subwoofer, be it in the boot or underneath the front seats. So a combination of all those drivers is what really results in the best audio experience. But as you can imagine, adding more audio drivers within the cabin does increase the cost of manufacturing, does increase the cost of design. And so that's where you see the differences between the lower end of the scale and the higher end of the scale in terms of audio quality you'll get within a car.
So Ian's had to pay more for people to cut a few more holes out in the design.
Yeah. I wanted the extra ones at the side there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, sometimes you'll even see manufacturers, actually, I say sometimes, a lot of the time, you'll see manufacturers include speaker grills that are just completely empty, just because for manufacturing sake, it's easier to mass produce, let's say, a door with two holes in them, one of them being with a speaker in it and the other one being empty. And so if they were to go for the trim above, you'd get the two speakers inside two of the grills. Whereas on the cheaper trim, as let's say your example you were saying, Ian, you'll find only a singular speaker. So there is room to upgrade for consumers, but from the manufacturer side, they'll actually think, actually, we're just going to do this for the ease of like the template and the molds and all that stuff, but just not include any hardware in it. And actually, not too long ago, there was a Tesla Model 3, the older model range, standard range models, that used to have the speakers included within the car, but just not connected, which is crazy. So you think Tesla worked out the philosophy of being, actually, it's cheaper for us to mass produce this car with these speakers in it, but just not connect them, so that people, if they wanted a better audio system, they'll have to go for the long range model. But then again, you could go retrofit and you can go aftermarket, and you could connect up those missing speakers within the cabin. I just find that absolutely mind-blowing, but it must economies of scale and the way that the manufacturers work it out must make sense.
I remember back when I was doing audio reviews much more often and talking to some of the speaker manufacturers, that they used to tell me that the drivers are one of the lesser contributors to the sound quality. It's more about the enclosure, which is an interesting challenge when you come to a car, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the enclosure is just as important as the speaker itself, because speaker technology fundamentally, specifically with the speakers that we're talking about, haven't changed all that much for a multitude of years. And I say multitude, I mean 2-3 decades. They haven't really fundamentally changed in terms of how they operate. And yes, the enclosure can help in terms of the resonance, sometimes in terms of the rattle you'll hear. But then there's loads of different factors to do that. You know, we're talking about the insulation of a cabin. If the woofer driver, for example, is not properly insulated, you'll hear rattle coming from the door, and that's just because the bass driver is rumbling the door, and you can hear the door rumbling, and therefore it detracts from the audio quality that you have and what you're experiencing. So yes, the enclosure does make a difference, but then I'm not sure which audio manufacturers you talk to, but some of them I'm pretty sure will argue that the manufacturing of the driver itself is just as important as the enclosure. So for example, I remember Bowers and Wilkins, they have got like a diamond coated tweeter, which I was just like, that's a bit extra. That seems a bit more than what you'd ever need. But the manufacturing process of the tweeter itself is, to them, important for you to get the best sort of audio quality, because of how it extends on the high-end notes. So it's as important as how it's going to be enclosed and where it's going to be placed within the car.
We've had a few changes in the way I guess home audio is working. I mean, way back, we would have the sort of hi-fi unit with a couple of speakers either side of it, and nowadays everybody's got single speakers sitting around, these sort of smart speaker type things, and 360-degree sound. Is there any kind of move to that in car manufacturing, actually moving down to less speakers?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think in terms of the higher end audio systems, I have not found that less speakers equals better sound. That's not, at least from my own experience. And generally speaking, I would say even in the consumer space, that's not quite the case not still. I mean, I can understand what you're saying in terms of like you'd have a hi-fi system and you'd have, let's say, a 5.1 system connected up to a receiver, and you'd have cables trailing all the way around the living room, and you'd have a 5.1 system, and how many audio drivers would you have within each of those enclosures? Let's say the bookshelf speakers or the floor standing speakers would be very much dependent on your setup and budget and all that stuff. But within a car, I feel, not saying more is better, but when you have more audio drivers within the cabin, you have more of an engagement with the audio that you're listening to. And going on your point that you were just saying in terms of the heightened metadatas like you'd find on, let's say, Dolby Atmos or DTSX on consumer systems, be it amplifier receivers / soundbars, you will also see that more and more in cars, specifically on the higher end of the scale, where they have more audio drivers that are incorporating 3D audio system or algorithms, which are utilizing more of the audio drivers within the cabin. Hopefully that makes sense. Effectively, more audio drivers equals more of an engagement with what you're listening to, and with incorporating 3D processing, you can engage more of those audio drivers to make yourself a bit more involved.
I found that in the car I actually get more immersive sound now than I do at home, because at home I've got the Sonos speakers, but they're standalone Sonos speakers. But when I'm in the car, I've got it in surround sound mode, and it's very immersive. And when I do mastering of my own music, after I've done a headphone mix, the next thing I do is listen to it in the car to see what it it sounds like in there. I know it's not the ideal reference, but for me, it's probably the most immersive.
Well, but it's also probably where most people are listening to your music as well. I know I do. So
so I like listening. I like using the car as a reference. Probably some musicians listening say, "Oh, you shouldn't be doing that," but I have got speakers up there but I mix most of the time on headphones. So the first time I hear it really loud, without disturbing everybody else, is in the car on my own. It's a great, but the car is an immersive space, isn't it? It's easy to have the surround sound speakers, whereas at home it's hard, with, like you said, with the wires and 5.1 setup. So it makes sense to have that immersiveness in the car.
And I think what you're doing is, okay, yes, the audiophiles out there will be like, what on earth are you doing in terms of putting your music to a car? Because also you have to think of the source. I think a lot of people actually forget this step, but when it comes to playing back audio, it's not just about the speakers, but it's how the source is being played, i.e. your music that you are taking and you're, let's say, putting on your phone. If that's then being transmitted over Bluetooth, you're already degrading a lot of your audio to your car system, which therefore means that you're already losing a lot of data, as in like music data, via Bluetooth. But then when you were to connect in, let's say via Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, and you use a wired connection, you're getting much better audio fidelity. And I can not say a night and day difference, but I can tell a difference when I'm plugged into a car versus when I'm using Bluetooth to a car. And by that, I mean a modern car, which is using all the modern systems and everything like that. Even via wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay versus wired Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, there's a very slight difference. And only, I think, a few people will actually notice the difference between the slight degradation you get over audio because you're using effectively Bluetooth and Wi-Fi with Android Auto and Apple CarPlay versus just using Bluetooth versus just using a wired connection. But on the flip side, the point I was going to make over here is, I remember there was Timbaland, the very famous producer, hip hop producer. He used to listen to his songs in a club because he wanted to hear how his songs that he was producing would sound in a club. And that's what made him so successful, other than obviously his technical prowess in creating incredible beats. It was the fact that he was listening to it where it was supposed to be listened to. So, for example, if you are producing music to where you think your target market is within the car, you want to hear how it's going to sound in a car, not with a set of, really expensive headphones or whatever it is. You want to hear how your target market is actually going to hear your music. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a really good story about that, actually, about target market and how things work out. So Ultravox Vienna, So in the UK, it was mainly played on car radios in mono, and listened to like that, and it sounds completely different to what it does in stereo. And in market, it was far less successful in markets where high fidelity stereo radios were the norm than it was in mono in the UK. And actually, when it was released later on and it was in stereo, it didn't do as well. and that's just, again, it's how you listen to it, how it comes, because obviously the beating was very central, and it just, yeah, but it's been really interesting how that the environment you're listening to can really affect the mood of the music and how it feels, and all that. One other thing I was thinking about when you're talking about speakers and talking about sort of the movie type systems, THX and all that, one of the things with EVs is people do spend a bit longer in the car charging, for example. It's actually sometimes it's quite nice to go and charge and relax and get away from everything. And I've noticed more and more people are watching movies or watching TV shows actually in the car. And obviously when you're, the one of the real advantages of EV, you can idle in an EV legally, which you can't do in a diesel or petrol car, and you're not going to have noise. It's sitting and silent, basically. So it actually makes quite a good home theatre type environment, especially with some of the bigger screens out there. And I haven't really noticed Dolby coming in, but I have noticed that there are more surround sound type systems starting to appear for that sort of playback.
Yeah, absolutely. You haven't got, let's say, Dolby Atmos, for example, or let's say Dolby Digital shown on the infotainment system. But there are certain things that use, let's say, Dolby Pro Logic, which is a 3D algorithm system that works and you can tailor it. The one I can think of that comes to mind is the BMW iX3. That has Dolby Pro Logic, and it's got a slider as to how much you want that surround sound effect to, well, effectively affect the audio quality that you're gonna experience. So yes, I think that will come in more and more, but that's the supports for those metadatas or the heightened codecs will be in the back end rather than you seeing it more on the front end, potentially, because I can't see why. Because because I'm just trying to think out loud over here, but when a soundbar manufacturer, for example, is marketing their soundbar, they say it supports, let's say, Dolby Atmos and DTS:X and Dolby Digital and MPEG-H audio, whatever it might be, because your source is going to be different. You're going to have a Blu-ray player, you're going to have, let's say, built-in Netflix, whatever it might be, you're going to have different sources. Whereas with the car source is determined by the manufacturer in the first place, because you've got usually a predefined number of apps that you can use, or built-in apps, or built-in infotainment system. So it might be the fact that, let's say, let's take an example of, let's say, Tesla. Tesla might have a contract with Netflix and Dolby to say, let's try and offer a heightened experience for our customers via your platforms. And then if you were to get a Tesla, you would see supports Dolby Atmos or supports Dolby whatever. That's where I can see the link coming in. But for us consumers, I don't think we'll see that as much, saying, oh, you've got this extra metadata you can play around with. At least from what I can tell and from the cars that I've seen, I've never seen that as an option to enable and disable. There was only one concept car, which was from Sennheiser, and they had, again, Dolby algorithm within it. But again, it was more of a slide the algorithm as to how much you want it to affect the audio experience rather than enabling and disabling it altogether.
It's definitely really interesting. I mean, it's the sort of thing we never have talked about 5 or 6 years ago. It just wouldn't have been a worthwhile experience.
And of course, things like the source, like you mentioned, that the sources have changed, haven't they? Like a few years ago, it was CD multi-changes in the boot and all that kind of thing. And that's disappeared now.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. The sources have changed, and it is interesting to see how the manufacturers are not only responding to that change, but also trying to cater for the people who haven't wanted to change. So there's a finite number of cars that I've come across that actually support micro SD playback and USB playback. Whereas if you go back a couple of years, when I say couple of years, maybe a decade, that might have been a bit more of a norm in comparison to just using Bluetooth. Whereas now Bluetooth is like a given, but then the other stuff that come with it are a bit more of a niche. So if you really want higher quality, let's say FLAC files or WAV files to be played, there's only a finite number of cars that actually will support that via USB and at the utmost audio quality. So yeah, it is different, and I think more manufacturers are streamlining the process and getting rid of those ports and getting rid of those inputs, which will come as a disappointment to a lot of individuals. But for the vast majority of consumers, they'll be like, I just use the app that's on my infotainment system on my car. So i.e., let's say Spotify or Tidal or whatever it might be, and or my phone. That's it. I don't use anything else. So yeah.
And the manufacturers are giving up a lot of the. Or do you think the manufacturers are giving up a lot of the UI ownership to Apple and Google now? Because I mean, since I got I stopped using BMW system and now just use the Android Auto. It's wireless. It just works. You know, everything works with the Samsung phone, and they've sort of lost a bit of that differentiation between manufacturers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. And I think it just depends. So for example, one good example for you is the smart car. So when I reviewed the smart car, I think in 2021, there's a smart EQ42. Not a car I would recommend, but that's another side. The smart EQ42 on a certain trim, unless you went for the top spec trim, effectively did not have any built-in navigation system. And the reason behind that is Smart claimed that their consumers are tech savvy anyway, and they're going to use Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. So why include the built-in navigation system? And I found that very fascinating, because when I first got in the car, I was like, where's the navigation system? There's always a navigation system. I can't find it. I even went on the manual. I looked online. I just couldn't find it. I had to ask them, and they came back and saying, yes, this car does not come fitted with it because, as I said, like they anticipate having Android Auto, Apple CarPlay. Is that becoming more of a norm? Yes, specifically with younger generations. A lot younger people are just going to be using that because that's what they're used to. But the older generation, which in my opinion are still very relevant in the car market, and the younger generation are not really relevant at this point because they can't afford those cars, those people are still going to want the built-in navigation system because they're not going to be using Android Auto, Apple CarPlay, and they might not even connect over Bluetooth to their car. They just want to rely on good old school radio or potentially DAB and built-in navigation system. They don't want all this other stuff, be it if they don't want to use it for a variety of reasons or simply because they don't have a smartphone. It could be one of the two. But yes, I think a lot of manufacturers are streamlining the process, and as we go on, we will see potentially less and less emphasis on the UI of the car itself. But of course, do remember the UI of the car doesn't just serve for navigation and phone, but it serves for a multitude of different things like vehicle settings, which you're not going to get on Android Auto or Apple CarPlay because that's irrelevant. It's just a mobile operating system. But you do have manufacturers out there that are partnering with Google. They can't partner with Apple, but they can partner with Google, and you have Android Automotive OS, which then uses an Android operating system as your infotainment system. But still fundamentally there is car settings that you're going to need to access, which you can't do on Android Auto or Apple CarPlay. So yes and no is the answer to that question.
Yeah, and I guess that the counter to that is people like GM in the States who are abandoning CarPlay and Android Auto because they, for your safety, I think is the line they came up with.
I don't know. I think that's more money more than anything, but I could be wrong in terms of licensing. But I don't want to. I haven't read too much into that one. But yeah.
But I guess especially in the EV world, the interior and the entertainment system is one of the limiters between cars, because a lot of all EVs perform pretty well. All EVs are reasonably quiet. So you need something to differentiate. And I could see manufacturers wanting to rake that back in and actually have control back over that, move it, get it away from Androids and the Googles and the Apples of this world. But they are the worst developers of software out there. It's just, I mean, I don't know how many VW ID series cars you've reviewed, but although it has got a lot better in the last few.
It has got a lot better. It was actually interesting. I met someone at the show we met at, and this gentleman had an ID3, and he said that the infotainment system has effectively led him to selling the car. Because it had so many issues and it had to go back to Volkswagen so many times. And by the way, on a side note, it's not something I've ever experienced. So I get car loans and I've reviewed pretty much the entire ID line. I've not experienced such a degree of issues that it leads the car completely useless and I can't use the car. But this gentleman was saying, actually, no, it was so bad that it's he's had enough of using the car, and even though he likes the car and it ticks all the other boxes, the infotainment system has really thrown him off, and he's just had enough of it, and he just wants to get rid of it because it's riddled with problems. Again, that's according to him, and fair enough. Like, he's looking at other cars now. But it's interesting how, of all things you'd think of, the infotainment system isn't, for me, the one that would have been like, oh, I need to take this car back. But of course, if that's the only thing that you're interacting with within the car, and it's fundamental in terms of you using the car because all your climate controls are there, and as we said, the car settings are there and whatever, then you're going to find that if that's something that's driving you up the wall, then you're probably not going to want to stick around with it. And in fact, I have had a few issues, but there's only been with MG vehicles, weirdly enough. I've had when the infotainment system would effectively freeze, ironically, when using Android Auto. So I was using Android Auto, I unplugged the cable, and it would freeze on the Android Auto screen. So I would switch on and off the car, switch it back on, and it was then attempting to connect over to Android Auto, but there was no cable connected to the phone. So it was thinking, oh, let me try and connect over Bluetooth, and it couldn't. And the only way for me to solve this would be to factory reset the car, which was ridiculous. And I reported it MG, and I noticed it in a few different cars that they offered, and I highlighted it in the reviews. So that is quite frustrating, because it means that each time I plug in my phone, my car has to be reset. No thanks, the car's going back. You sort out your firmware issues. I don't want to wait for your firmware issues. You should sort that out before you ship it out to consumers. So
yeah, I think it is more of it, something which people make a decision on. I mean, certainly I've heard people say, "Oh, the car doesn't have Android Auto, I'm not buying it." So it's very, very much that. But I don't think actually one of the things we've lost in the modern world, and it's probably understandable with the integration of all the controls into touchscreens, is the ability to customize the cars quite so much. So I mean, when I was growing up, you didn't have a car radio supplied by the manufacturer. You might do if you was a BMW or Mercedes, you get your Alpine or whatever, but you went out and got one from your local car entertainment shop.
Kenwood.
Kenwood or Sony or whatever. I mean, it's where Sony first really made its big penetration into the UK market, was through car audio. And you had your ISO ability to slot in and slot out, and you could all the connectors were standardized, and that's no longer the case, and no, it doesn't have to be the case anymore. It used to actually be a law that you used to have to be able to do that, and that's not anymore. So and I think that is a little bit of a detriment in some ways, because we got some real innovation from those systems over the years. I mean, you talked about the CD changer, and that was a third party came up with that before any of the car manufacturers did. I think that's a little bit of a shame in some ways.
Yeah, I think the customization element of it is something that I will say, in terms of like the custom scene, I'm not just talking about like the audio system, I'm talking about the entire car itself. Like, you would see cars out of Need for Speed Underground with neon lights underneath them and massive spoilers and wide body kits and all that stuff, whereas you don't really see that nowadays with modern cars. Is that because it's no longer in fashion, or is it the fact that people who are buying the cars don't care about them, or is it the fact that they don't have the ability to that and there's less suppliers of those type of aftermarket solutions? I'm not sure. But yeah, I do remember, like you, that like the pop out radio as such, and you'd put that in your glove box or underneath the seat type of thing, and you'd hide it, and because it, depending on the quality of it, you don't want it to get nicked. And equally, you'd go into, let's say, a retailer, and you have like a wall of speakers that you can just listen to, and that still exists, but I don't think it's as relevant as it was back in the day, where that was more of a norm. You'd get that sort of upgrade no matter what car you had. Was it a Ford KA, or if you had a Bentley Bentayga, or I don't know if, Bentley Continental, let's say, you'd go out and do that. Whereas nowadays, I think even a person who buys the equivalent of a Ford KA will be like, yeah, that's what it is. I'm not going to bother upgrading everything and customizing it. But again, I'm not sure if that's to do with trends and fashion, or availability, or even cost. So
I remember going with my dad to have his Kenwood fitted to his Cortina, and like you said, you would buy the speakers. You would pick which ones you want, which radio you wanted, and they would fit them for you. And the speakers were the parcel shelf had the space without the speakers in it. I remember. I think they were, the cutouts were there already, and you just slotted your choice of speakers in there.
Yeah, because it was the DIN, wasn't it? It was the DIN standard for. And some cars still do have a DIN slot connection. I know that behind, underneath some of these fancy front displays, you actually disassemble them. You can get back. You do find a DIN box underneath.
Because that led to it was always the thing of theft, though, wasn't it? You can have your car stereo nicked, and that was such a common thing. Now that I don't think that isn't a thing now, because it's all built in. So I suppose that's the other side of that, is that we don't get that same thing. People smashing the window just to get in and nick the radio.
Well, they just nick the car instead.
Yeah.
That's the flip side. I'm sure some of your listeners will be like, but have you heard about the increase of theft of keyless entry cars? So it's just the car instead, rather than the accessories that are comprised within. But in terms of the rest of the audio system, as in within the car, I do also think that comfort comes into it as well. I know you were saying before, Gary, about the noise reduction technology that you've got, active noise cancellation. I do think that's actually going to come and become more relevant in the future. You're going to have more increased technology that's used within the cabin to make sure that you're having a bit more of a serene in-cabin experience. I know I'm going a bit of a tangent over here, but I do think that's something you're going to see more and more of. And I see it more in the higher end cars. I can see that filtering down to more of the budget or more affordable cars in the future.
And it's even with petrol cars, there is some element of feeding engine noise, isn't it, back into the cabin to enhance the sound of the car. And it wasn't until a few years ago I realized that they would. So I couldn't. Why? Sure, you want to reduce noise, but now that's part of the features of the car, isn't it, to improve that sound. And it's electronically enhancing the engine sound.
Exactly. Sometimes, I mean, with EVs, there's no engine sound. Well, as you know, there's no engine sound, and you can't really hear the motor or anything like that. Even though, for example, you hear, like, let's say, Formula E cars whine around, you don't have that on the consumer cars. But they have fake noise that's being played through the engine, and I actually think it's a bit silly, because it's nice to have that serene in-cabin experience, but some people will want that increased amount of engagement. Now, what I do like, however, is that certain manufacturers, as in more specifically the Hyundai Motor Group, with Hyundai and also Genesis, have included almost like a gear shift within the car. But there is no gears when it comes to electric cars, at least not those cars. There's no like a 2-speed transmission or anything. And it literally simulates gears. So you're going in first gear, you'll go to, let's say, 30 miles an hour, and the car will be at its maximum red line, and it won't accelerate anymore. Even though the car can, it's electronically limiting itself that you can't accelerate more. You need to shift into second gear, and it's a virtual second gear. And I genuinely love that. So my dad's a car mechanic, so he's quite old school. He's a car mechanic for over 30 odd years, 40 years now. And he loved that when I showed him that, he was just like, the noise, okay, it's nice to have, but that gear feeling, it just adds to the engagement that a driver has. And I think this is one of the biggest complaints that petrol heads have when it comes to coming to an EV, other than the fact that the weight and the handling characteristics. It's the fact that you don't have that level of engagement with a car anymore. And even purists will say, like, even an automatic is rubbish. You need to have a manual box, of course. But yeah, if you want the convenience of it, you've got the Tiptronic transmission, for example, on, let's say, a Volkswagen, and you have that engagement by going up and down on a gear selector or flappy paddles if it's a sportier vehicle, but you don't have that at all with EVs. But now they're incorporating that with EVs, and I really love that. When I drove, it was a Genesis, I think GV60. I absolutely loved that, and I was just like, that is so cool. It's not something I think I'll use every day, but if I want that extra bit of engagement, I'm going around winding country roads, I'll enable that function and get that little bit of feeling when I'm driving again.
It's definitely interesting, the whole engagement thing. I mean, I talk about handling. I actually prefer the handling of EVs, just because they tend to have very low weight. So to go, someone I know in the motorsports industry said, we spend years trying to get a perfect balance to set up and a low centre of gravity and with an EV it's just done because you've got the battery down there.
Well, it's true. Yeah, you get this. You get that lower center of gravity, but yes, on the flip side, it is a lot heavier. And I will say, is driving a regular petrol car and then going to an EV, you can feel the weight. So it just depends as to how you're driving. I think for the vast majority of people, and I think this is kind of the EV bashing that goes around. And I'm by no means someone who's going to be like, you need to buy an EV tomorrow. There's nothing else out there in the world like an EV fanatic. But I will say that for the vast majority of consumers who can afford EVs, when you're driving, you will actually prefer the driving experience with an EV because it's just seamless. There's no gear changes. It feels really progressive. There's a linear torque curve. And even when you go to the high performance vehicles, you just feel like you've got a lot of power, and you don't have to wait and choose what gear to be on. Like even launching a 911, it rumbles, it goes from first, second, third, fourth. It's really quick with that PDK gearbox, but you compare it to an EV, it's just linear, one gear, and it's just gone. It doesn't have to be gear changing and be advanced as, like, let's say, a Porsche 911. It's phenomenal. That for the most consumers, that is exactly what you're going to want. And yes, in terms of that driving experience, other than obviously we were talking about the in-cabin experience, the actual driving dynamics are probably going to suit most consumers because they just want to go from point A to point B and want to have a nice leisurely drive in it. But yes, the purists or those people who are more concerned about driving at speed, or for example going track driving, EVs are not going to be for them because that weight that you're carrying around can be felt when you're applying pressure on the brakes, no matter how beefy the brakes are. Let's say on a Porsche Taycan to a budget, I don't know, VW up, you're still going to find that the brakes are not as well suited in comparison to just a regular petrol car. The braking power and the ability of braking and turning and shifting that weight around, you're just not going to get in the EV, at least not now. Obviously not with the current technology that's out there, you're not going to get that. But yeah, for the average driver, absolutely, I totally agree.
Yeah. To counter that, when I was driving the I-Pace, obviously the torque vectoring on there, which you can't really do as effectively without electric motors, did compensate for that quite a bit, and actually made for a very, it's certainly the fastest thing I ever slung around a corner. So I felt comfortable slinging around the corner. But yeah, But I think you're right. I mean, technology is going to move on, and there's all sorts of innovations coming down the curve to actually make the drive more engaging for those people who like that sort of thing. And I think the sound system is definitely one of those things. I mean, I find I love the fact that my car's quiet and I can listen to music and get really engaged with music. And that to me is and I think that's the sort of the grand tour, isn't it? The old that cruise type of cruising experience is what I would like to have. And yeah, listen to Ian's music in the car, bombing down the motorway.
Yeah.
That you can tell him
Yeah,
his sampling's off or something like that.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, but it's yeah. I mean, we've come, like I said from the start, we've come a long way since I was going getting tape decks out of scrapyards to fit into my Morris Marina, and you know, now you jump in these cars and they've got amazing speakers and audio systems, and you almost take them for granted now. I mean, even in like the budget cars, you've got fantastic sound in there compared to premium cars of a few years ago.
Agreed. Yeah. There's a big there's been definitely a big push in that, specifically in the EV space. And yeah, it's something I actually mentioned to one of the manufacturers. I said, you know, the progression of how budget cars, when I say budget, I mean, it's still very expensive in the EV space, but how the more affordable market on the EV space is still actually quite good in terms of what you're getting, in terms of like features, in terms of quality, in terms of audio system, driving experience, in comparison to, let's say, when I was learning to drive, or even before that, when my dad was driving me around to school and things like that. I remember that when you jumped in a budget car, you felt that you were in a budget car. You could see there was loads of really harsh plastic around you. The seats were not comfortable. The audio system was terrible. The driving experience just wasn't there. And then you jumped into a mid-range car, you saw massive jump in quality. Whereas nowadays, I don't think there is as much of a jump between the the low range to the mid-range, at least when it comes to EVs. Even on the regular cars, like petrol or diesel cars, I think manufacturers have put a lot more emphasis in terms of like, what do you actually get as standard from the lower end of the scale, which in some ways is making it harder for the manufacturers to upsell to a better model, let alone trim a better model car, because people will be like, oh, well, this budget car is perfectly comfortable. It ticks all the right boxes. It's got all of this and that, and I don't know, lane assist and lane steering control and adaptive cruise control, and I don't need a 15 speaker audio system. A 6 speaker system will be more than enough for my podcasting listening needs. I don't need anything more, so why should I go for a more expensive car? And again, when it comes to EVs, you've got electric range and performance, and more often than not, performance is a non-issue, because you're getting cars even on the most budget end of the scale which will go from 0 to 60 in sub 9 seconds, which, if you think about that, that's actually ridiculously fast. And yeah, in terms of the range is where the biggest differentiator is actually when it comes to the EV space. You're looking at paying more for a bigger battery pack and how that battery pack has been incorporated in. But yeah, now we've got even more competition in the space, and you're seeing that even further reduced down, where actually the range is not being the differentiator anymore. It's other features within the car that are being the differentiator. But how much does that affect consumers? I guess we'll find out in a couple of years to see how much of the uptake has been for these more premium brands or premium cars versus the more budget cars. Budget per se, more affordable cars, shall I say.
Yeah.
So what's your favorite in-car audio system at the moment, Chris?
Well, the favorite one, it was recent, well, not too recently, but BMW i7 Bowers & Wilkins system was phenomenal. Like across the board, was absolutely jaw-dropping. I went to hear that, and I just couldn't believe how well it did across the sound frequency range. It just did a tremendous job. There's nothing that I would have really changed in that. And ironically, we're talking about that Dolby processing and all that stuff. They had, I can't remember how many audio drivers. There's a lot, like over 15 to 20 audio drivers. But when you disable the audio processing of that extra Dolby sound, it would actually disable some of the speakers, and they would not be in use anymore. Which I actually asked the engineer there. I was like, well, why do you do that? Why do you not? And they were like, well, because we believe that if there's a reference sound, you don't need all those extra audio drivers within the cabin, and you're getting a bit more of a unidirectional sound. And I was like, yeah, well, that's the problem. You're getting a bit less of that omnidirectional sound. In other words, something to be a bit more engaging, and you're getting something that sounds like it's coming straight in front of you, which I guess is how you would traditionally mix and listen to audio. But I didn't quite understand. I was like, well, why not just enable all the speakers? But then when you have the processing, it just kind of elevates that experience because you've got more audio drivers within the cabin. But yeah, that's the one that really stood out for me. Out of all the audio systems I've heard so far, very expensive car, very expensive audio system. But yeah, in terms of EV audio, or at least audio systems I've heard, which is in excess of 100 cars, the ones that I've reviewed, that's the one that really stood out for me. And so much so that I actually had to title it the new benchmark for audio, because I had to then update all my older audio system reviews to reflect that actually they weren't as good as this one is. So because I've got a rating scale for sub bass, mid bass, mids, highs, and soundstage, and specifically the mid range and the soundstage was just that extra step better on the i7 than it was in comparison to the other systems. So I had to go back on the other systems and update them, which might be bad for people who are looking at some of the older audio reviews and saying, oh, why is the rating changed? But it's because I can't have the same rating of, let's say, 10 out of 10 for the mid range on an older audio system. Let's say the I don't know, a Bentley Bentayga hybrid with a name audio system, because it's no longer relevant in comparison to this i7, which set the new benchmark. So yeah, that was my favorite in-car audio system that I've reviewed to date. And also, I would say, on a side note, the Sennheiser Ambio audio system that I heard, which was a concept car, which was comprised with, again, Bowles & Wilkins audio system within a Volvo XC90, I'm going to say, the older generation XC90. And they'd worked with Continental, which are the tire manufacturer, by the way, to do the audio within the car. So Sennheiser, Continental, and Bowles & Wilkins, and also, of course, Volvo. And that audio system was really, really cool in terms of giving you that immersive audio experience. But unfortunately, that's not a car that anyone can buy, at least not with that audio configuration. But that was also another excellent audio experience that I had, which I wish would come to market.
Great stuff. So thanks for joining us, Chris. So where can people find you?
So on every social media platform you can think of, other than Snapchat, and you can also find me by just simply Googling, be it Totally EV if you are interested in cars, or Totally Dubbed HD if you're interested in consumer tech. And again, that's audiovisual products that I review. So I do a lot of soundbar reviews and also PC monitors. So yeah, if you want either tech or cars or both, then you'll find me on every single social media platform you can think of, or including on LinkedIn if you want, as Christopher Minasians.
Well, that was good stuff. I really enjoyed that. I mean, I love listening to music in the car. I can't imagine not having music in the car. So it's a really important subject for me. So yeah, I really enjoyed chatting to Chris. I
might have to go out and try test drive my 8 now just to see what that sounds like. That sounds amazing.
I think I'm going to have to look at that. So we'll be back same time, same place next week, and then I've got something for the week after, maybe a bit different, so we'll talk about that next week. So yeah, till next week, Gary, we'll see you then.
Okay.